Day and welcome to Caribbean Currents, a quarterly online program produced and presented by the Nature Conservancy Caribbean Division that discusses important environmental topics impacting our lives, sharing the work of our incredible staff, from scientists, conservation practitioners, to those working in policy, and highlighting amazing places where we work in the Caribbean. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really do appreciate you spending this time with us. I am your co-host, Cleveland Sam, and my co-host is none other than...
Hello, everyone. My name is McAllen Durkin, and I work at the Coral Innovation Hub land-based nursery in St. Croix, USVI. I take care of the land-based nursery corals, and I work part-time with the dive team as well. I'm so excited to be co-hosting the very first episode of Caribbean Currents. Today, we are discussing a topic that everyone who lives in the tropics should be interested in and concerned about. It is coral bleaching in the Caribbean and how we are fighting back.
Yes, McCullen, we have a stellar panel of coral reef experts and partners to discuss this topic. And I would like you to introduce the panel.
Sure. As I introduce you all, could you please tell us a little bit about your organization and what you do there? Elizabeth Schaefer.
Everyone, I'm Elizabeth Shaver. I'm a coral reef ecologist with the Nature Conservancy's Caribbean Division, and with TNC, I lead our coral reef conservation strategy.
Aldo Croker.
Hi, everyone. My name is Aldo Croker. I am a coral reef ecologist as well. I have been working on bleaching, coral diseases, and many aspects of coral reefs for over 25 years. Now I work for TNC as the Marine Conservation Program Manager for the Central Caribbean. Very pleased to be here.
Awesome. Jessica Ward.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jessica Ward. I'm the Coral Program Director for the TNC, the St. Croix, U.S. Virgin Islands Coral Innovation Hub, where we are focused on large-scale coral restoration.
Awesome. Yasmin Evangelista.
Hola a todos, mi nombre es Yasmin Evangelista, yo soy estudiante de biología en la Universidad Autónoma de Santo Domingo, República Dominicana. Trabajo actualmente con enfermedades de coral como parte de mi trabajo final de investigación y también trabajo en el Ministerio de Medio Ambiente de República Dominicana en el Departamento de Gestión y Conservación de Ecosistemas Marinos.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And now that we know who you are and what you do, let's start with the basics.
Thank you, Cleveland. I have a few questions that I would think is beneficial to ask for all the non-coral professionals watching this program. We will be directing questions to one panelist at a time, but please feel free to add anything after they completed their response. Aldo, perhaps you'd like to take the first question. Could you tell us what coral bleaching is and what causes it?
Okay, so one thing that we must understand in order to know what bleaching is that corals have evolved for thousands of years with an intimate association between microalgae that resides in their tissues. Those macroalgae are named zooxanthellae. So the zooxanthellae and the corals establish a very tight relationship, a mutualistic relationship that benefits both, right? That provides a lot of advantages, both to the zooxanthellae and the corals, but it has a problem. That relationship is so tight that when the conditions that allows that relationship to work perfectly are not met, the symbiosis just breakdowns. And that process of breaking the zooxanthellae and the coral symbiosis is what we call coral bleaching. So coral bleaching is nothing less than the breakdown of the mutualistic relationship between the algae and the corals. And it is caused by stress, environmental stress. Most of the times, the environmental stress is caused by heat, but could be also caused by drops in salinities and many other environmental factors.
Thank you for that explanation. Yasmin, are corals dead when they are bleached?
como Aldo explicó, el blanqueamiento es la ruptura entre el alga endosimbionte, que es parte del coral, está en el tejido del coral, y el blanqueamiento se produce cuando esta relación se rompe. Normalmente los corales no mueren cuando se produce el blanqueamiento de forma inmediata, sino que se vuelven vulnerables a estrés ambiental, y esto sí podría provocar otras afecciones que podrían concluir en la muerte. Claro, si el estrés por temperatura se prolonga, esto podría provocarle la muerte también a los corales, pero si estas temperaturas vuelven a la normalidad, es decir, si el estrés térmico se reduce y las temperaturas vuelven a la normalidad, pues el coral puede recuperarse. Pero no necesariamente cuando se blanquean los corales mueren o están muertos, sino simplemente están en un estado de estrés que pues los vulnerabilizan ante otros factores ambientales.
Thank you so much. Jessica, what is zooxanthellae and how long can corals survive without them?
So both Aldo and Yasmin touched on this a little bit. The zooxanthellae are the symbiotic algae that live inside coral tissue, giving them their color. The zooxanthellae are important because although corals can physically feed themselves, they have mouths, they have tiny tentacles that they can pull plankton from the water and feed themselves with. They get the majority of their energy from the photosynthetic products of zooxanthellae. So when water temperatures rise above normal for extended periods of time, this can lead to a breakdown in the photosynthetic system of the algae, leading to oxidative stress in the coral's tissue, which then causes them to expel those zooxanthellae to try and prevent any further damage. And when that happens, we get this state known as bleaching, because all that color left, leaving you able to see the white skeleton of the coral through that tissue. And because they rely on the zooxanthellae for food, they can starve after prolonged periods in this bleached state. Some species can survive as little as 10 days or so without zooxanthellae. Others can survive weeks or months depending on their level of autotrophy, and that means their ability to feed themselves. And so it varies by species and environmental conditions.
Okay, great, Jessica. So that leads me into my next question nicely, and I'm going to direct this to Liz. How do corals get nutrients while they are bleached? Liz?
So as we've been talking about, corals are these really amazing animals that are able to get nutrients in two ways. And one is that they get about half of their nutrients from these microscopic algae that photosynthesize and generate sugars that the corals eat. When those algae, the zooxanthellae, leave, it leaves corals in this starvation state, essentially, because they're not getting half of their nutrients. So they will continue to get nutrients from the other way that they get food, which Jessica said, they have these small tentacles. They're really closely related to anemones. So you can think of corals as these really, really small anemones that have little tentacles in the water column, and they capture small zooplankton like copepods, which are shrimp-like zooplankton, or other food particles that they then ingest. So they can live like this, like Jessica said, for maybe weeks or months. But again, that starvation state's a very stressful place to be in. And if water temperatures don't come back to normal, corals will remain bleached and starving, and eventually will die from that. If temperatures go back to normal, the zooxanthellae can actually go back into the coral tissues, and largely many corals can recover.
Jessica, you mentioned that there are some more resilient coral species than others. Back better to bleaching?
Sure, it depends on a lot of factors, and even within a certain species, you're going to have a big spectrum of who's more resilient than their neighbors. Different factors include the specific genotype of the coral, the tissue thickness, energy reserves, density and type of the zooxanthellae that they harbor. So there are many different, what used to be called clades, but they're essentially different groups of zooxanthellae, and some are more resistant to UV light penetration, others are more resistant to heat, and certain species tend to harbor certain groups, whereas some species of coral can harbor many different ones. So all of those factors can really influence how susceptible a particular coral is. Generally speaking, the faster growing, more complex branching species tend to be more susceptible to coral bleaching, whereas slower massives can be a little bit more resistant, but there are obviously exceptions to that rule, and it differs between the Pacific and the Atlantic. Here in the Caribbean, the coral that you see behind me, this is Cropra palmata, which is elkhorn coral, and even though it is a big branching species, it tends to bleach last. And in fact, the last few bleaching events that have occurred in the Caribbean have not caused bleaching in this particular species. However, the current bleaching event that has unfolded throughout Florida and the Caribbean, we're now witnessing the bleaching of this particular species, which indicates just how bad this particular bleaching event is. So I guess sort of locally in these Caribbean waters, sort of an order of bleaching that we've observed would be Millipora alcicornis, which is not and complanata, which is not actually a stony coral tissue. It's a stony coral species. It's a hydrocoral, but those tend to bleach first. Those are very sensitive, and they all tend to be that complicated branching type of structure, very fragile. Acropora cervicornis is starting to pale and bleach. And then we do see some massives that bleach earlier than others, the orbicellas, which is a type of star coral. We see those bleaching on the majority of reefs around St. Croix and the Virgin Islands right now. So, it does differ by area, it differs by genotype. Corals that grew up in a really shallow area where they're constantly bombarded by UV and high temperatures might be a little more resilient. So when heating takes place for multiple weeks over the summer and it starts to penetrate to those deeper depths, those corals are going to be more susceptible because they're used to cooler waters, right? They're not up on the surface. They're not in the regularly hot water. So it depends on the length of the degree heating weeks that these corals experience. So there's a lot of different factors, and it's not necessarily a rule of thumb of who bleaches first.
Okay, thanks. Because I want to ask Aldo at this point as well. I know you spoke, Jessica, about the different species, but Aldo, are there parts of the world that experience harsher bleaching events than others?
Yes. Well, the problem of heat stress is global, but there are areas in the Indo-Pacific, for example, depending on the geomorphology of the coast, the patterns, the oceanographic patterns, where heat stress could reside for longer periods, and that's by the end of the day. By the end of the day, what leads to bleaching. So bleaching is accumulated, and the conditions there allows that problem. You will find more bleaching. The last massive bleaching event, for example, in the Indo-Pacific, occurred along the Great Barrier Reef, and it was lethal. And the area that got the worst impact was the area where they had the strongest management in place. And the reason for that was because in that area, the heat stress remained for a longer period and was more intense compared to other areas in the GBR. So yes, the answer is correct.
But now let's switch our attention to remedies and solutions and what organizations such as the Nature Conservancy are doing to tackle the problem. And I'm going to ask my colleague, Colin, again to kick this segment off for us.
Sure, Cleveland. How do we manage reefs to combat the effects of bleaching? Jessica?
Sure. So just to give an example of what we're doing with the Coral Innovation Hub, we've implemented a number of strategies to try and deal with coral bleaching that's unfolding in the Virgin Islands. And luckily for us, it did happen a little bit later in the Caribbean than it had. A little bit later for us in the Virgin Islands than it did in Florida and the Caribbean. So we had a little bit of time to try and come up with some solutions to protect our corals. So one of those steps was to take all of our material from our offshore nurseries, bring them into our land-based nursery facility. We're able to control the light and the temperature and bring them into much more favorable conditions to prevent them from bleaching. And for the corals that we weren't able to bring in particular Acropora palmata, which doesn't always do great in the land-based nursery. We also have what we refer to as orchards, where they act as nurseries, but they're actually attached to the reef themselves. So we're not able to bring those in. We were able to install some innovative shading techniques, and maybe I can share my screen. So this is an example of small shade structures that are over our quote unquote orchard corals that are growing on the reefs, and we're not able to bring those in. So we did something similar on our actual nursery tables as well. These are rigid tables that we have in sandy areas next to the reefs where we conduct restoration. And so for the corals that we had to leave in place there, we were able to erect these slightly larger panels of shade cloth that reduces the amount of sunlight reaching those corals, and hopefully the heat as well. So it seems to be working so far. We have some nurseries and some orchards where we installed these, and some where we did not. And the ones where they were installed seem to be doing much better. So it does seem like that is effective preliminarily anyway.
Tell us what else you are doing in your region, you and Yasmin as well.
Bueno, en el caso específico de República Dominicana, aquí hay organizaciones que durante todo el año están realizando monitoreos de salud arrecial. Como mencionó Aldo, los monitoreos son muy importantes para saber cómo poder gestionar nuestros arrecifes ante los factores que están afectándolo en estos tiempos. Y parte de estas organizaciones se encuentran como en una organización, en una red general, donde todos están, se llama la Red Arrecifal Dominicana. Estos monitoreos se realizan durante todo el año a nivel nacional, y más recientemente se ha propuesto un protocolo para levantar datos y ver cómo los arrecifes a nivel nacional están evolucionando por los factores que están incidiendo en ellos, especialmente este evento de blanqueamiento. Este protocolo fue gracias a doctor Aldo Crocker, y se está implementando a nivel nacional para así poder ver cómo los arrecifes están respondiendo a este evento de blanqueamiento, y esos datos se están levantando y se están generando, y creo que van a servir para poder ver cómo ha afectado en el presente y en el futuro este evento de blanqueamiento y el estrés térmico en nuestros arrecifes, y también cómo este evento está afectando, como mencionó Aldo, la restauración. En República Dominicana, desde que comenzaron a reportarse los blanqueamientos en los arrecifes, las colinas blanqueadas, bueno, notamos que en la mayoría de los viveros de coral, que son parte de las herramientas de restauración que se implementan en República Dominicana, gran parte de los tejidos se habían blanqueado, y otros tejidos estaban vivos, no se blanquearon. Entonces, parte de las herramientas que se están implementando es ver qué está pasando, porque algunos se blanquean, porque otros no, porque unos mueren y otros simplemente resisten al mismo estrés térmico. Entonces creo que concuerdo con Aldo de que el monitoreo en República Dominicana en verdad es una herramienta para poder ver cómo están evolucionando nuestros arrecifes de coral ante este nuevo factor ambiental.
Go ahead, Liz.
Okay. Thank you. So I just wanted to mention the management of coral reefs. Restoration is actually one really critical, but one tool that we have in our toolbox in terms of managing reefs. It's really important actually how we care for coral reefs and how we manage them on a day-to-day basis in order to help them deal with and better withstand and survive bleaching. So we know that things coming from land into the water really can cause this low-grade chronic stress to coral reefs that they experience every day. Things like wastewater that can include pollutants, chemicals, fertilizers, sewage, all sorts of things that should not be in the water. We know that overfishing coral reefs, that can also cause an imbalance in the reef ecosystem where reefs aren't there, or fish aren't there to eat algae. And when they're not there, the algae overgrows and they can smother corals. And this is also really stressful for corals. So you can think of it like how we treat our body. If we're not taking care of ourselves every day, if we're not eating well and we're not sleeping enough, we're stressed, when these events like if you get sick with the flu, you're just not going to be able to withstand or deal with that as well. It's the same thing for corals. They're getting these chronic everyday low-grade stressors, and they're just not able to be as resilient to these events that happen that are, like bleaching events or disease events. It can really impact their resilience. So I just really wanted to mention that our day-to-day management of coral reefs really does impact, and we have lots of studies to show that this does improve coral resilience to bleaching when reefs are generally healthier and there's just less threats and less stressors on them.
Great. Liz, while we have you on monitor, I mean, I know a lot of people might say, we all know this, but why are corals so environmentally important to us? And therefore, if we allow them to be degraded, what are the significant impacts on our lives?
That's a great question. Coral reefs are actually one of the most important ecosystems on our planet. They're often called the rainforests of the sea, and that's because they just have so much marine life that live on them. Corals, as we've said, they're these little tiny organisms like anemones, but they have these hard shells, and they grow these hard colonies, put a whole bunch of those colonies together, and they grow these reefs that you can imagine in the open ocean. There's just sand and there's not a lot of shelter, but corals grow these reefs that all of these marine species use as shelter to have homes and protect themselves from predators and have protection for their babies and find food. And actually coral reefs just cover a small fraction of the ocean floor, just 1%, but 25%, a quarter of all marine life, use coral reefs for their home at some point in their lives. So you can imagine just those numbers alone, you can tell how critical coral reefs are for marine life. But they're also super important to people. They're the natural breakwater for a lot of tropical islands. Coral reefs are responsible for baffling about 97% of wave energy coming to shore. So it's essentially all wave energy is getting stopped by coral reefs. And that allows us to have calm waters on the shoreline where we can have beaches and homes and hotels. And when coral reefs are degraded, they become flattened or lost completely. Then a lot more wave energy reaches shore, and we get things like erosion or flooding or storm surges when we do have these big storm events. They're also really important for fisheries. As I mentioned, tons of animals live on coral reefs, and so they provide enormous amounts of fish for people that often use them as a direct source of protein. And these are really sometimes local communities in low-income or middle-income countries that need this protein source and also need the revenue. It's a really powerful mechanism, this fisheries, to make money for many communities. And then for many countries that have reefs, it's an enormous part of their revenue coming into the country from tourism. So of course we think of tourism on reefs as snorkeling and diving, and of course for those people, I think it's pretty clear how important reefs are for tourism. But if you are in the tropics as a tourist and you like to walk on the beach, or you like to eat seafood at a restaurant or go kayaking, those are all because we have reefs. So reefs are so important. I can't stress it enough. And it will be really difficult for hundreds of millions of people to have the fish that they need, or the revenue, or the protection from storms. So it's really critical that we save reefs, we protect them and restore them.
Thank you.
Just to add a little bit on that, I like to tell people that they should think about reefs as if they were like big cities. Like imagine New York. Why there is so many people in New York? Because it is structurally complex. You have buildings of different shapes, sizes, different kind of spaces in the city. So those buildings are the corals. And when the stress comes and when bad management is in place and we cannot avoid these chronic impacts to kill corals, what happens is that all those buildings will, collapse. And you will end up not with that large and nice city. You will end up with ruins, right? No place to live, no place to get food, no place to enjoy the beauty, nothing like that. So that's what happens when we fail to manage coral reefs and we see these systems decline in front of our face.
Thank you, Aldo. I was actually going to ask you if you'd like to add to that, because that was my next question. Cleveland, go ahead.
Sorry, send this question to Yasmin in terms of, do you have any hope, Yasmin, for the future in terms of the projections for hotter summers and the survival of coral reefs?
Pienso que la esperanza de que estas proyecciones que actualmente tenemos sobre mayores temperaturas, veranos más calientes y cómo estas proyecciones van a afectar cada vez más la salud de nuestros arrecifes. Pienso que es un panorama bastante complejo respecto a no solamente lo que se está proyectando, sino la situación global que hay respecto al cambio climático y sobre todo las acciones que se están llevando por parte de los gobiernos para tratar de mitigar estos impactos. Creo que, como mencioné, es un panorama complejo, pero me mantengo optimista respecto a que todavía podemos tomar acciones que estén al nivel de demanda que se espera de los tomadores de decisiones y de los gobiernos para poder reducir estas emisiones de gases de efecto invernadero y así poder contribuir a mitigar el problema del cambio climático. Sobre todo, quiero mencionar que estas acciones conllevan que no solamente los tomadores de decisiones asuman esto, sino que también la sociedad en sí pueda conocer del problema y ver cómo juntos podemos solucionar o por lo menos aportar o contribuir a que esto mejore o que por lo menos el panorama se vea más esperanzador.
Stony coral tissue loss disease has been affecting the Caribbean corals for a while now, and I was wondering if either of you would like to respond, as if you could give any insights on whether there is any relationship between skittle and coral bleaching.
Sure, I can take a first stab at that. So although we don't understand the full etiology of the disease, we don't understand everything that is responsible for it. It might be multiple components. We believe that a major component of it is a viral disease of the symbiotic zooxanthellae. So the zooxanthellae are what end up leaving the coral during the bleaching condition, right? So since the zooxanthellae are expelled, this could potentially reduce the presence of the disease in affected corals. And we are actually hearing that from researchers in areas like Florida, where the prevalence of the disease seems to be reduced during coral bleaching events. So although that might seem like good news, as everybody has kind of touched on a little bit throughout this presentation, is that corals, when they're bleached, they are in a severely stressed state, and so that reduces their fitness, which makes them ultimately more susceptible to disease. So we know that historically, when major bleaching events have come through, like for example in 2005, that was the last major bleaching event in the Caribbean that greatly reduced coral cover in certain areas, but not all of that was due to the bleaching event itself. So what happened was, the year following that bleaching event, because the corals were so reduced in their fitness due to that experience of stress, they became a lot more susceptible to disease. And so a lot of diseases came through and tended to wipe out those corals. Because stony coral tissue loss disease is newer, it's only recently impacted areas in the Caribbean in the last few years, we don't really know what's going to happen following this bleaching event. So although this particular disease has sort of disappeared or is laying low during this bleaching event, for all we know, during the next year, once corals recover from the bleaching, they could become more susceptible to that particular disease.
Well, thank you for that. For the last question, I would like to ask, everyone if you could each tell us one thing that the public can do to help save coral reefs in their daily lives.
Sí, gracias. Una muy buena pregunta, porque en verdad me gusta siempre dar no solamente la razón del problema en la situación, sino ver cómo las personas tratan de involucrarse en la situación y buscar una solución. Pienso que las personas en general que tal vez no estén tan familiarizadas con el tema podrían educarse, concientizarse sobre la problemática y cómo está funcionando todo. De esta manera, cuando conoces la situación, puedes pensar, oh, ¿qué puedo hacer para solucionar esto? O ¿en qué puedo aportar para que esto simplemente finalice o mejore? Y creo que involucrar al público en general, la educación ambiental es una de las principales herramientas para nosotros poder, o el público poder involucrarse en el tema y poder aportar soluciones a esto. También el apoyo a organizaciones que se encargan de o que trabajan con la conservación marina, pueden hacer voluntariados para servir como apoyo técnico también en los monitoreos de campo, en la difusión de informaciones para poder replicar el conocimiento y que así haya cada vez más personas que estén interesadas en las soluciones y sobre todo apoyar las políticas ambientales, las políticas públicas enfocadas en la conservación marina para que de alguna forma cada vez la conservación de nuestros recursos marinos pueda ser más efectiva, pueda ser más oficial y que la ciudadanía, las personas que se encuentran directamente en las áreas costeras y marinas puedan verdaderamente darle el valor y que merecen las áreas protegidas. Pienso que de esta forma, con educación, concientización, aporte de la comunidad, de las personas, podemos hacer cambios significativos, cambios puntuales ante la problemática y sobre todo que estas pequeñas acciones a nivel local puedan servir para poder aportar a la situación global que estamos viviendo ahora mismo.
How about you, Liz?
Yeah, so I think about in answer to this question in two categories, I guess. One is if you are in the tropics and you're close to a coral reef, what actions can you take? And the other is if you're far away from a coral reef, which many of us are in the world. So I think if you're in the tropics and you're close to a reef, there are things you can do, like remembering to, if you're snorkeling or diving, never touch, kick, hold on to corals. That really damages them and causes a lot of stress. Similarly, if you're in a boat, try not to anchor ever on a reef. Wearing reef safe sunscreen is also an easy thing to do. And buying, sustainable seafood options when you can is also a great action. If you're far away from coral reefs, there are many things you can do to still be, helping coral reefs in an indirect way in terms of trying to reduce your impact in terms of climate change. So that's using public transportation when you can, eating less meat, voting if you have that facility. That faculty to do that, or in other ways, elevating your voice to help change local or national policies to support climate action. And like Yasmin said, spreading the word to others, I think, on the importance of coral reefs is a great way to have an impact wherever you are in the world.
Thank you. Jessica, anything else to add for the public?
Sure, I had sort of a similar response to Elizabeth, where, if you're far away or looking at long-term impacts, that's more thinking about the climate change aspect and how we can reduce the effects of bleaching over the long term. And that's, thinking about things to reduce your own footprint. But a lot of those things are out of your control or feel out of your control. But there are still little things that you can do that are very directly related to coral, especially if you live on the coast or near the waterways. And that is being able to, as Liz mentioned before, increase the resilience of local reefs, which means reducing their stressors. So we talk about, reducing land-based sources of pollution, sediment, runoff, and all of that. But that also goes down to you and your yard, right? And the way you manage your own little community and your household. So whether or not you decide to put fertilizer on your lawn that can run off into a canal, which will eventually make its way to coastal reefs, things of that nature. So, you know, you are very much tied to the land, especially when you're close to the coast. So anything that you do on your land, on your property, changing your oil, washing your car, things like that, that can end up washing out to sea and eventually to our corals. So always having that in mind and ways to increase local resilience of our reefs is a good way to go about trying to help your reefs.
Thank you so much. Cleveland, this has been a very interesting discussion, and there's still so much to talk about on this topic. However, maybe next time. We want to give the panelists an opportunity to give their final words as we bring the program to an end. Aldo?
Sure. So I'm going to be brief. So reefs have been there for millions of years. They don't need us. They will survive without us. However, our future depends on coral reefs. We need them. So that comes to a point when you think that we must stop. So the Anthropocene has been driven by humans and technology. So maybe it's time for us to step back, think about what we're doing, and understand that if we eliminate a system that is very basic and important for the global dynamics of our planet, if we do not think that and understand that, then our future is going to be jeopardized. But I have, hopes that we are going to stop, think, and act in the proper way.
Awesome. Thank you. Liz?
Yeah, I think that what Aldo said is excellent. I guess I'd piggyback off of that and say that, humans are incredibly smart animals. And I think that we have, created a world in which we've thrived and have created climate change problems. And we are smart enough to find solutions. So I think it's in all of our power to come together and find solutions and save this ecosystem, because we don't want to lose a whole entire ecosystem. This is our opportunity, I think, to really figure this out together collectively before other ecosystems might be next. And we certainly don't want that. So like what Aldo said, we need reefs. Even, hundreds of millions of people directly need reefs, and many, many, many more in indirect ways. But I think that we have the ability to come together and solve the problem.
Thank you. And last but not least, Jessica.
Sure, I think everybody had really great responses, and it's hard to think of another message beyond that. But I think I would say, it's really easy to lose hope these days. You turn on the news and you just have a lot of depressing things out there. And especially if you've been a practitioner in Florida and the Caribbean for a number of years, you've seen just one thing after another impacting these corals. And it's very easy to get down. I know that I have my days, but I think I'd stress to never give up and never lose hope. Especially, in the face of all of these restoration efforts that are happening right now, really support your local coral restoration practitioners, because the way that I look at that is really, it's kind of like during COVID, right? So we anticipated that a lot of people were going to get sick from this, but when you did your part and took some of these mitigations on yourself, what that did is it flattened the curve. So it allowed this population to be able to deal better with it down the road. I think that's kind of what we're doing right now with all of this restoration, is we're giving corals a chance to build their own resistance and resilience in the face of these stressors, as well as sort of like punting these effects down the road a bit to give us time to come up with more innovative solutions in the future.
What a discussion. I want to say a special thank you to our esteemed panelists on this, our first episode of Caribbean Currents, and to you, McCullen, for agreeing to be my co-host today. To our viewers, thank you so much for viewing this program. And if you enjoyed our program, please leave us a comment and subscribe to our YouTube channel. If there's an environmental topic or issue you would like to feature on Caribbean Currents, do let us know. And of course, you can contact us at email caribbean.news@tnc.org. That is caribbean.news@tnc.org. For more information on the work of the Nature Conservancy in the Caribbean, you can also visit our website, nature.org/Caribbean. And of course, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. On behalf of my co-host, McCollin, and the rest of the team at TNC Caribbean, I am Cleveland Sam. Until next time, goodbye.